Hey everyone, it's Carl again, and I was thinking the other day, boy, AD&D and the new clones are kind of popular now. People are really enjoying it. So the question is, should you be playing old school revival OSR games? Should you bring them as part of your gaming group and maybe set D&D 5e or some of the newer games aside for a while and just try the old stuff? It's a TPK. It'll ruin your day. But hey, it's okay. I'm Carl with Tabletop Tango. If you like what you see, please like, subscribe. And today I'm going to talk about maybe you should be playing some OSR, old school revival games. What's old school revival? These are games that kind of have their DNA shared with old D&D. Lots of times they fix some of the flaws that were in the old game, like THACO, the hit armor class 0, which is, a running joke forever. They kind of fixed that, maybe bring in some of the things from the more modern games. But in the end, it's all a feeling around kind of the old way games were built, the original games from early 70s and 80s, or the late 70s, early 80s. They're games like Basic Fantasy, Low Fantasy Gaming, even Dungeon Crawl Classic harkens back to those days. So that is what OSR is, but why should you play OSR? What might be some of the things that make it, fun and useful for you? Well, the first one is generally there's fewer rules. And that's not always true, but in general, there's fewer rules. The rule books are they're laid out in a way that takes you through. There's different things that can happen, but it's not nearly the complex beast that you have. Kind of like, look at Pathfinder 2e, 680 pages of different rules that cover almost everything. A lot of the old school games, they don't cover everything because they're expecting the game master to sort of make a judgment call. And if you look at even the original AD&D, Player's Handbook and the DMG together, the Player's Handbook is pretty small. The DMG is not that big compared to how big 5e is and how big some of these other game books are that you'll find in the market. So again, that's not always true, but you have things like usually there's fewer stats. There's not skills generally. They don't have skills. Some games do, but mostly they don't. So if you think things that harken back to AD&D, there's no skills. It's really, except for a thief, but there's no skills. It's really just 6 attributes, just kind of raw at the metal. Next thing that may make it interesting is that the character creation tends to be simpler. Advancement is more regimented. So as you gain levels, things happen specifically at those levels. As a fighter, you get more attacks at this level. You get more proficiencies here, and it just kind of takes that progression. And what makes your character interesting is how you play them. Not that I've picked a bunch of feats and I pulled this in and I have all these feat trees which make things complicated and I have to make sure I do my build out right. A fighter was a fighter. What made him interesting was all the trappings that you provided. A swashbuckler versus, a good old-fashioned military tank from the medieval days on horseback. What made him different wasn't the fact that, they had a subclass or they had some prestige class. What made him different was how the players played. So the character really was the framework you built upon. So trappings really made the difference, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Next thing is what's kind of gets cool for a game master is they talk about rulings over rules. And this goes back to what I said initially. They're kind of simpler. There's more to the game master to make a judgment call. Can I do that? Yeah, that seems like you could do that. Make a dexterity check, as opposed to, oh, there's a skill that represents throwing stuff, and there's a skill that represents tumbling, and there's a skill that represents all these different things. Nah, it's just, well, you want to do it? Seems like something you might be able to do. Make me a roll on your dexterity, because you only have 6 stats. So real simple, straightforward. The game master's making the rulings, he's making the call, she's making the call, and that's just how it proceeded. It wasn't like, let's go look up page 400 that tells me exactly how, grenades bounce or whatever. It's, yeah, we'll make a call. It seems like it would have gone that way. And that also plays into things like when you're searching a room or you're doing things like that. There's no, well, I have a notice check and then I take 20, or I've got my perception that's just going all the time. It's really, hey, I'm searching the room. Well, how are you searching it? Well, I'm going to look under the bed. I'll look in the dresser. I'll tear the tapestries down. Okay, you found something behind the tapestry. Made a ruling. Wasn't part of rolling dice. It's just more simple. Harder for the game master maybe, but it's just simpler. Something that I think attracts some people to the old school stuff is it can be more deadly. It doesn't have to be, but generally back in those days, you got 0 hit points, you were dead. In some cases, some people played 0 hit points, you're down, -10, you're dead. But in the end, it was very easy to die. There was save versus death, where if you got hit by something that could kill you, you made a saving throw, you didn't, you're dead. So it was much deadlier. That's maybe not a positive, but for some people it's kind of cool. It gets you on your edge, gets the adrenaline pumping. You know that your character is in a dangerous situation, and it's tough. So that might be a reason you might want to play an OSR kind of game. Player skill versus player character skills. I think I alluded to that when I talked about things like searching the room. In old school games, a lot of it is as a player being smart on how you played. There's kind of legends of, dangerous traps that if you didn't, tap with your 10-foot pole, or, hey, I rolled ball bearings down to see if there's a slope. Those things you wouldn't normally do in a new, more modern game, because there'd be notice rolls or perception checks, or, I have a skill in a certain thing, so I should be able to find out that there's something going on with the floor, or I should be able to notice there's a thing like that because I have skills in that. It was more what the players knew versus what their characters had lists of skills on the sheets that you can pick and choose from. So it might make it more interesting, may make it harder, because now, it's you've got a wizard who's supposed to be super smart, but the player playing him's not as smart. So maybe I didn't think of looking behind the tapestry, but my wizard would have. Now we got rulings over rules. The game master should think about that and say, hey, I'm going to make a ruling that's something you probably should have figured out. Roll your smarts. And if you roll below your smarts, yeah, we'll let you find that. So kind of another play on it. One of the things that I think people might disagree with, but I think in the older games, prep was easier because you didn't have as complicated of a stat blocks. Things were defined. You could very easily just say, I got a creature, it's going to be 9th level, it's going to have this many hit points, done. Let's just run with it there. Here's its armor class. Yeah, it's going to slash you with claws. Okay, well, those are some points. Kind of easy to kind of build that up. Obviously there's tons of monster manuals you could pull sheets out of and roll. But it seemed like it was easier to prep. At least for me when I was back then, it seemed like it was so much easier to prep. Maybe it was because the older school games were more dungeon delving, and so it was easier to build a dungeon versus a big story arc that had lots of intertwined factions. I don't know. It seemed easier to me back then. One of the interesting things, and I'll end up here, that somebody might think is there's a lot of tables. Now, is that a positive or a negative? Some people just love rolling on tables. There's tables for treasure, there's tables for random monsters, there's tables for everything. And it just adds this air of nobody knows what's going to happen at any time. Even the game master might not know what's going to happen. And so it adds that element of surprise where you can't just hang out and do that long rest because you never know what's coming. And one dice roll away, you might find something that you've always wanted, but it also might be worthless. It's all in the hands of the dice. Now, not everybody plays that way, and nothing says that OSR has to be played that way, but it's something you'll see. A lot of tables. In the back of the old DMG even, there was, tables and tables to do a random dungeon. You could practically run your own game just for yourself, just by rolling on tables and building out a dungeon that way. So it's kind of cool. It adds a little bit of spice to life, and it's something that's more typical in an OSR game. Maybe you disagree. That's how I feel about it. So what do we got? Fewer rules, maybe less complicated. You don't have a lot of skills and feat trees and stuff like that. Character creation is simpler. Progression is more linear. There's not all these different branches you could take to try to make the optimal character. Rulings over rules, classic. Less rules, more the game master doing rulings. It can be more deadly, makes it more interesting, maybe for some, maybe for not. Player skill versus the player character skills. Again, you're playing not yourself, but you are imbibing more of the story in, because you're not relying on, hey, I can just roll a skill and solve the problem. And I feel like there's less prep. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in your game there wasn't, but in my games it feels like less prep, and there's lots of cool random tables you can roll and roll and roll to your heart's content. So maybe if these are interesting, maybe you should be playing an OSR game or try it out. And I mentioned some at the beginning, and I have a great blog that I'll put a link to that has like 20 or so of them, just tons of them, and you can pick one that you think is cool to try out and just see whether it makes sense. Well, anyway, this is Carl with Tabletop Tango, and if you liked it, like, subscribe, and maybe you should play some OSR. Talk to you. It's a TPK, it'll ruin your day, but hey, it's okay. It's a TPK, it's a TPK. The characters had their day, nothing left to play. It's a